Why Alien Mercenaries Fear Deathworlders Special Forces. Part 1. The year was 2347, and humanity had been part of the Galactic Coalition for 30 years, but most alien species still treated them like children who had barely learned to walk among. The stars, and the reason was simple enough because Earth was classified as a death world, where everything from the weather to the wildlife seemed designed to kill anything that lived there, and the older species who came from gentler worlds could not imagine how humans had survived long enough to develop space travel at all. The crisis began on a mining colony called Epsilon 9, where a heavily armed rebel faction had taken 300 civilians hostage and barricaded themselves inside the main processing facility, and the situation had dragged on for 2 weeks while the Galactic Coalition tried everything they could think of to resolve it peacefully. But the rebels were not interested in talking, and they had enough weapons and supplies to hold out for months. Commander Zekthar of the Crimson Talons was the 5th mercenary leader to accept a contract to end the siege. And he was a Krillian, which meant he stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms covered in scales that could stop most small arms fire, and he had fought in over 200 battles across 50 star systems, and never once had he failed to complete a mission, and his reputation was so fearsome that most enemies surrendered when they heard his name. But the rebels on Epsilon 9 did not surrender. Zekthar led his team of 40 elite warriors in a direct assault on the facility's main entrance, using shaped charges to blow through the reinforced doors and plasma rifles to sweep the corridors. But the rebels had prepared well, and they used the tight confines of the mining facility to their advantage, and after 6 hours of brutal fighting, Zekthar was forced to withdraw with 12 of his warriors dead and twice that number wounded, and he could not understand how such a small group of poorly trained rebels had defeated his professional soldiers. 4 other mercenary groups tried their own approaches over the following days, and each one failed with heavy casualties, and the problem was always the same, because the facility's layout favored defenders, and the rebels knew every corridor and air duct and service tunnel while the mercenaries were fighting blind in an environment designed for mining equipment, not military operations. Captain Helen Ward stood in the command center of the GCS Horizon, watching the latest failed assault on the monitors, and she was the human liaison officer assigned to coordinate with coalition forces, and she had been arguing for days that Earth's special forces should be given a chance to handle the situation. But the alien commanders had dismissed her suggestions with barely concealed contempt because everyone knew that humans were newcomers who had nothing to teach species that had been fighting wars for thousands of years before Earth even had fire. But after the 5th failure, the Coalition Command was desperate enough to listen, and they sent a message to Earth requesting assistance. And within 18 hours, a small transport ship docked with the Horizon, carrying exactly 5 human soldiers. And Zekthar watched them disembark with a mixture of curiosity and doubt, because they looked so small and fragile compared to his warriors, and they carried weapons that seemed primitive compared to plasma rifles and gravity hammers. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was the team leader, and he moved with an economy of motion that suggested he never wasted energy on unnecessary movements, and his eyes were constantly scanning his surroundings, cataloging threats and exits and potential cover. And beside him walked Sergeant Linda Hayes, who carried enough demolition equipment to level a small building, and Corporal Danny Price, who moved so quietly that even Zekthar's enhanced hearing barely detected him, and Private First Class Nicole Grant, who seemed too young and small to be a soldier at all. The 5th member of the team was a communications specialist named Kyle Brooks, who immediately began setting up equipment that would let them monitor every electronic system in the facility, and Jake spent exactly 4 hours reviewing the facility, blueprints and the after-action reports from the previous assault attempts, and studying video footage of the rebels, and then he called his team together for a briefing that lasted less than 10 minutes. Zekthar demanded to observe the briefing, and Jake agreed without hesitation, and the Krillian commander listened as the human laid out a plan that seemed insane, because instead of assaulting the main entrance or trying to breach the walls, Jake intended to infiltrate through the waste disposal system and move through the facility in complete darkness using night vision equipment and strike at multiple points simultaneously to create confusion and panic. The alien commanders monitoring the operation gave the humans 6 hours before they expected to add 5 more bodies to the casualty list. But Jake and his team moved to the insertion point as the colony's sun set, and they disappeared into the waste system without fanfare or dramatic speeches. And for the first hour, nothing happened on any of the monitors, and the alien commanders began to think the humans had gotten lost or trapped in the maze of pipes and tunnels. Then the lights in the facility went out, and emergency systems failed and backup generators never activated, and the rebels suddenly found themselves in absolute darkness, and they began firing their weapons at shadows and shouting to each other, trying to maintain cohesion, but their voices gave away their positions, and one by one they fell silent. The alien commanders watched in growing horror as their thermal sensors showed the rebels disappearing from their posts, and no bodies fell, and no sounds of gunfire echoed through the facility, and it was as if the darkness itself was swallowing the rebels whole, and Zekthar leaned forward studying the monitors with an intensity he had never felt before, because he was watching something he had never seen in all his years of warfare. Jake and his team moved through the facility like ghosts, and they used suppressed weapons that made less noise than a whisper, and they communicated with hand signals and subtle movements that required no words, and they had spent years training to operate in exactly this kind of environment, because Earth's military had learned long ago that darkness was a weapon, and silence was armor, and fear was sometimes more effective than bullets. Linda Hayes reached the hostages first, and she moved among them with calm efficiency, marking the ones who needed immediate medical attention and preparing them for extraction, and the civilians were terrified. But she spoke to them in a low, steady voice that somehow made them believe everything would be fine, and Nicole Grant began treating the wounded with supplies she carried in a pack that seemed far too small to hold everything she pulled from it. Danny Price had positioned himself on the facility's highest point with a rifle that could put a bullet through a credit chip at 2,000 meters, and he provided overwatch and eliminated 3 rebel leaders who tried to organize a counterattack. And each shot was so precise that the other rebels never even knew where it came from. And Kyle Brooks had taken control of the facility's computer systems and was feeding information to Jake about rebel positions and movement patterns. 17 minutes after they entered the facility, Jake's voice came over the command center speakers, calm and professional, and he reported that all hostages were secure, and all rebels were neutralized and requested extraction, and the alien commanders sat in stunned silence because what should have been impossible had just happened, and 300 civilians walked out of that facility without a single casualty among them. Zekthar watched the human team emerge from the facility, and they moved with the same controlled precision they had shown going in, and their weapons were clean, and their equipment was properly stowed, and they looked like they had just finished a routine training exercise rather than one of the most difficult hostage rescue operations in recent coalition history, and he felt something he had not experienced in 3 decades of warfare, and it took him several minutes to recognize the emotion as fear. The human soldiers were not larger or stronger or better armed than his warriors, but they had won where everyone else had failed, and they had done it by fighting in a way that no one in the galaxy had ever seen before. And Zekthar realized with absolute certainty that these Deathworlders did not fight like soldiers at all, and they fought like apex predators, and Earth had taught them to hunt in darkness and silence and to kill with efficiency that bordered on art. Captain Helen Ward found Jake Morrison in the debriefing room, and she was smiling, because she had been trying to tell the coalition commanders for weeks that humans approached warfare differently, but they had not believed her until now. And Jake was writing his after-action report with the same methodical attention to detail he brought to everything else. Zekthar requested a meeting with Jake, and the human agreed, and they sat across from each other in a small room, and for a long moment neither spoke, and then the Krillian commander asked the question that was burning in his mind, which was how humans had learned to fight like that, and Jake considered the question carefully before answering. He explained that Earth was a world where humans were not the strongest or fastest or most dangerous predators, but they had survived by being smarter and more adaptable and more willing to do whatever was necessary, and they had spent millions of years learning to hunt prey that was bigger and faster and better equipped to fight. Why alien mercenaries fear? Deathworlder Special Forces. Part 2. 3 months had passed since the incident at Epsilon 9, and the story of what happened there had spread through every mercenary network and trading post and military base across the Galactic Coalition, and the tale grew with each telling. But the core facts remained the same, which was that 5 human soldiers had accomplished what dozens of professional mercenary teams could not, and they had done it in 17 minutes without losing a single hostage or taking a single casualty. The mercenary guilds were facing a crisis they had never encountered before, because clients were now asking specifically for human operators, and traditional contracts were being cancelled or amended to include clauses that stated no engagement if human special forces were involved. And this was devastating to an industry that had existed for thousands of years and had been built on reputation and proven capability. Frixnal was an insectoid mercenary broker who controlled security contracts across 12 star systems, and his compound eyes could track multiple data streams simultaneously, and his chitinous hands moved across holographic displays as he calculated the financial damage that humanity was causing to his business, and the numbers were catastrophic, and he decided that something had to be done to restore the natural order of things. He contacted Zekthar through encrypted channels and offered the Krillian commander triple his normal rate to eliminate the human special forces team that had humiliated the mercenary community. And Zekthar listened to the proposal in silence. And then he did something he had never done in his entire career, which was to refuse a contract, and he explained that Vrixnal did not understand what they were dealing with, and that sending mercenaries against these humans would be sending them to their deaths. But Vrixnal was desperate and greedy, and he believed that Zekthar had simply lost his nerve after one encounter, and he began putting together a coalition of 8 different mercenary teams, totaling over 200 of the most dangerous fighters in the galaxy. And he gathered intelligence on human training operations and discovered that 2 teams would be conducting exercises on the jungle moon of Tarsus 4 in 2 weeks. Coalition intelligence detected the mercenary buildup around Tarsus 4, and Captain Helen Ward brought the information to Colonel Frank Gibson, who commanded Earth's Special Operations Command, and Gibson was a man who had spent 40 years in uniform and had seen combat on a dozen worlds, and he listened to the briefing with his fingers steepled under his chin, and then he smiled in a way that made Helen uncomfortable. Gibson authorized both Razor 7 and Razor 9 to proceed with their training exercise exactly as planned, but he also sent them additional intelligence packages and equipment and explicit instructions that they were to treat this as a live combat scenario, and that the goal was not just to survive the ambush but to send a message that would echo across the entire galaxy. Lieutenant Jake Morrison gathered his team and the members of Razor 9 in a clearing on Tarsus 4, and he laid out the situation in his usual economical style, and he explained that over 200 mercenaries were moving into position around them, and that these mercenaries thought they were hunting humans, but they were about to learn that on Earth humans were the apex predators, and everything else was prey. Sergeant Linda Hayes had brought her full demolitions kit, and she spent 6 hours rigging the jungle with traps and surprises that would have made her instructors proud, and she used natural materials and scavenged equipment to create weapons that the mercenaries would never detect until it was too late, and Corporal Danny Price moved through the canopy like a shadow, marking positions and calculating ranges and preparing hides that would let him control entire sections of the battlefield. Private Nicole Grant set up a field hospital in a cave system that Danny had discovered, and she prepared to receive casualties because even though the humans had every advantage in this environment, they were still outnumbered more than 12 to 1, and combat was unpredictable and people died when bullets started flying. The mercenaries moved into position over 3 days, and they used standard tactical doctrines that emphasized firepower and coordinated assault, and they expected the humans to either flee or dig in and prepare for a defensive battle. But the humans did neither of those things, and instead, they went on the offensive in a way that no military manual in the galaxy had ever described. The first mercenary team disappeared on the second night, and they were a group of 6 Vraxian warriors who prided themselves on their night vision and tracking abilities. But they never saw the humans coming, and Danny Price eliminated their point man from 800 meters with a suppressed shot, and then Jake and Linda moved through their position like ghosts, and the Vraxians never even had a chance to call for help. The second team found the bodies of the first team arranged in a pattern that made no sense, until one of them realized they were looking at a human tactical symbol that meant Hunter, and the mercenaries began to understand that they were not the predators in this scenario, and fear started to spread through their ranks like poison. Vrixnal monitored the operation from orbit, and he watched as team after team went dark on his displays, and he kept sending orders to press the attack and to use their superior numbers. But the mercenaries on the ground were experiencing something they had never felt before, which was absolute helplessness, because they could not see their enemy and they could not predict where the attacks would come from, and every shadow seemed to hide death. The humans used the jungle environment in ways that seemed impossible, and they moved through vegetation that should have been impassable, and they used the sounds of the jungle to mask their movements, and they understood that the other species were afraid of this environment, but humans had evolved in jungles and savannas and forests, and they were at home in any natural terrain. Sergeant Kevin Ross from Razor 9 was a combat engineer who specialized in turning environments into weapons, and he had spent 2 days studying the local wildlife and geography, and he used that knowledge to create situations where the jungle itself seemed to attack the mercenaries and trees fell at exactly the wrong moment, and swarms of local insects descended on positions that had been marked with pheromone attractants, and rivers suddenly changed course to flood enemy camps. Jake Morrison captured a Krillian mercenary who had been separated from his squad, and he sat the warrior down and explained in simple terms what was happening. And he told the mercenary that humans had spent millions of years learning to hunt, prey across open savannas where there was nowhere to hide, and they had learned to track animals for days without rest, and to coordinate hunts that required perfect timing and communication. And that skill had been refined through thousands of years of humans hunting other humans. The mercenary asked why humans were so good at this kind of warfare, and Jake considered the question and then explained that Earth was a world where everything was trying to kill you, and the weather could change from beautiful to lethal in minutes, and the wildlife ranged from insects that could kill with a single sting to predators that could tear through armor, and humans had survived all of that by being more adaptable and more stubborn and more creative than anything else on the planet. Linda Hayes detonated a series of charges that brought down 3 massive trees in a coordinated pattern that trapped an entire mercenary squad in a box canyon, and then Danny Price convinced them to surrender by putting rounds into the ground at their feet from a position they could not locate, and the squad leader later said that fighting humans was like fighting the jungle itself, because you never knew where the attack would come from, and you never felt safe, even in positions that should have been secure. By the 4th day, the mercenary coalition was falling apart, and commanders were arguing with each other, and some teams were trying to withdraw, while others wanted to press forward, and Vrixnal was screaming orders that no one was following, and the humans had achieved what every Special Forces operator trained for, which was to make the enemy defeat themselves through fear and confusion. Jake made the decision to end the operation, and he sent a message on an open channel that every mercenary could hear, and the message was simple, which was that the humans were giving them 6 hours to evacuate the moon, and after that, anyone still in the operational area would be considered hostile and treated accordingly, and the mercenaries did not need to be told twice. The evacuation was chaotic, and several teams left wounded behind in their haste to reach their ships, and Nicole Grant and her counterpart from Razor 9 treated those wounded with the same care they would give their own people, because that was what human military doctrine demanded, and the mercenaries who received that treatment spread word that humans were not monsters despite fighting like demons. Zekthar had observed the entire operation from a safe distance, and he had tried to warn Vrixnal that this would happen, but the broker had not listened, and now the mercenary community's reputation was in ruins, and more importantly, over 40 mercenaries were dead, and 3 times that number were wounded, and all because they had underestimated the species from the Death World. Colonel Gibson sent a personal message to Vrixnal after the mercenaries had withdrawn, and the message was delivered through channels that ensured every major player in the Why Alien Mercenaries Fear Death Worlder Special Forces. Part 3. 6 months after the incident on Tarsus 4, the galaxy faced a new crisis that made the previous situations look like minor border disputes, and a rogue faction called the Syndicate had emerged from the outer systems with technology that should not have existed, and an army that seemed unstoppable, and they had already conquered 3 coalition member worlds using tactics that combined overwhelming force with advanced shielding that made conventional weapons almost useless. The Syndicate was led by a warlord named Kraj who belonged to a species called the Thanics, and they were massive creatures that stood 12 feet tall with natural armor plating and 4 arms that could wield heavy weapons as if they were toys. And Kraj had gathered an army of 50,000 warriors from a dozen different species and equipped them with technology that intelligence analysts suspected came from illegal weapons research. Helios Prime was a peaceful world known for its universities and research centers, and it had a population of 20 million civilians who had never known war, and when the Syndicate fleet appeared in orbit, the planetary government immediately called for coalition assistance, but the nearest military fleet was 6 days away and Helios Prime's planetary shields would fail in 72 hours under the sustained bombardment. Ambassador Trelvik was the Heliosan representative to the Coalition Council, and he was a thin, graceful being with pale blue skin and large eyes that seemed perpetually sad, and he stood before the council chambers and begged for someone to help his people because 72 hours was not enough time to evacuate 20 million civilians, and if the shields fell, the syndicate would sweep across the planet and millions would die. The coalition military commanders argued about strategy and debated the merits of different approaches and calculated acceptable casualty rates, and Ambassador Trelvik listened to them discuss his people's lives like they were numbers on a spreadsheet, and he felt despair settling over him like a cold blanket, until Captain Helen Ward approached him in a corridor outside the council chambers. She told him that there was one option that no one had mentioned yet, and that Earth could deploy Special Forces teams within 12 hours, and that those teams could buy time for the civilian evacuation and possibly even stop the syndicate advance. And Trelvik looked at this human officer who barely came up to his shoulder and asked how many soldiers Earth could send, and Helen told him 3 teams, which meant 36 operators total. The ambassador thought she was joking because 36 soldiers against an army of 50,000 was not a military operation. It was suicide. But Helen explained that human special forces did not fight armies directly, and they fought the infrastructure that supported armies, and they fought the command structures that controlled armies, and they fought the supply lines that fed armies, and if those things were destroyed, then the army would collapse on its own. Major Lisa Chen commanded the overall operation, and she was a strategic planner who had studied military history from 100 different worlds, and she understood that the key to defeating a large force was not to match its strength for strength, but to find the critical vulnerabilities and exploit them until the entire structure fell apart. And she had identified 3 targets that would cripple the syndicate's ability to maintain their siege. The teams deployed from a stealth ship called Shadow 6 that was piloted by Captain Ben Murphy, who had a reputation for being able to fly through situations that would make other pilots refuse to even try, and he brought his ship in low over Helios, Prime's southern continent, using the planet's magnetic field to mask their approach, and the 3 teams dropped from the cargo bay at an altitude that would kill most species, but humans had been doing high-altitude insertion since before they had space travel. Jake Morrison led Razor 7 to the main power relay station that fed energy to the Syndicate's siege weapons, and the station was defended by 200 Syndicate soldiers and automated defense systems, and it should have been impossible to approach without being detected. But Jake had learned long ago that impossible was just a word that people used when they had not thought hard enough about the problem. The team moved through the night using terrain features that the Syndicate defenders thought were impassable, and they covered 12 kilometers in 4 hours without making a sound, and Danny Price eliminated 6 sentries from distances that the Syndicate's sensors could not detect, and by the time the alarm was raised, Jake and Linda Hayes were already inside the facility. Linda had brought enough explosives to level a city block, but she did not need that much because she understood that the key was not to destroy everything, but to destroy the right things in the right order, and she placed shaped charges on structural supports and power conduits with the precision of a surgeon, and when she triggered the sequence, the entire relay station collapsed inward like a house of cards. The second team was led by Lieutenant Sophie Blake, who specialized in psychological operations, and her target was the Syndicate's communication network, and she understood that an army of 50,000 soldiers needed constant communication to maintain coordination, and if that communication was disrupted, the army would fragment into isolated groups that could not support each other. Sophie's team infiltrated the main communication hub by posing as Syndicate maintenance workers, and they had studied the protocols and uniforms and even the body language of the Syndicate personnel, and they walked right past 3 security checkpoints, because no one expected enemies to simply walk through the front door. And once inside, Sophie planted a virus in the communication system that would activate in exactly 6 hours. The third team was commanded by Chief Warrant Officer Sam Torres, who was a weapons specialist with a talent for improvisation, and his mission was to destroy the Syndicate's main supply depot, which contained ammunition and fuel and food for the entire army, and the depot was located in a fortified compound with overlapping fields of fire and sensors that could detect a mouse at 300 meters. Sam looked at the defenses and decided that a frontal assault would be suicide, and a stealth approach would take too long, so instead, he did something that made perfect sense to a human, but seemed insane to everyone else, which was to walk up to the main gate with his hands raised and request to speak to the commander, and when the guards brought him inside, he triggered the demolition charges that his team had attached to fuel trucks parked just outside the perimeter. The explosion destroyed half the depot and created enough chaos that Sam's team could fight their way to the main ammunition storage and complete their mission. And Sam himself was wounded in the fighting, but he refused medical evacuation until the last charge was placed and the entire depot was burning like a small sun. When the team extracted, Kraj received reports of the attacks within minutes of each other, and he could not understand how such small teams had penetrated his defenses and caused such catastrophic damage, and he ordered his forces to hunt down the humans and kill them. But his orders never reached most of his army because Sophie's virus had just activated, and the communication network was showing phantom contacts and mixing up unit designations and creating confusion that spread through the syndicate forces like wildfire. The syndicate army began to fragment as units lost contact with their commanders, and supply chains broke down, and automated systems started malfunctioning, and Kraj realized too late that he was no longer fighting a military campaign, but trying to hold together an organization that was falling apart from within. Jake Morrison regrouped with the other teams at a rally point in the mountains, and they had lost 3 operators killed and 7 wounded, including Sam Torres, who had taken shrapnel to his chest, but was still conscious and complaining that the syndicate soldiers could not shoot straight, and Nicole Grant was working on him with practiced efficiency while calling for medical evacuation. Major Lisa Chen watched the tactical display from orbit, and she could see the syndicate forces losing cohesion as commanders tried to restore order without communications or supplies or power for their heavy weapons, and she sent orders for the teams to continue harassment operations, but to avoid direct confrontation because the goal was not to defeat the syndicate army through combat, but to make them defeat themselves through chaos. Over the next 3 days, the human teams struck at water purification plants and vehicle fuel depots and command posts, and each attack was precisely calculated to create maximum disruption with minimum risk, and the syndicate soldiers began to see humans everywhere even when there were no humans present, and paranoia became as effective a weapon as any explosive. Kraj watched his army disintegrate, and he could not comprehend how 36 soldiers had done what entire fleets could not, and he sent a message to the human commanders offering a truce if they would explain their methods, and Major Chen sent back a single word, which was no, and then she ordered one final strike. Danny Price had positioned himself on a mountain ridge 3 kilometers from Kraj's command ship, and he had been lying in the same position for 16 hours, waiting for the perfect shot. And when Kraj stepped onto the observation deck to survey his crumbling army, Danny put a round through the warlord's primary heart, and the Thanix leader fell without ever knowing what killed him. The Why Alien Mercenaries Fear Death Worlder Special Forces Part 4-1 Year after the victory at Helios Prime, the balance of power in the galaxy had shifted in ways that no one could have predicted, and the mercenary industry that had existed for thousands of years was facing extinction, because clients were no longer hiring traditional mercenary companies, and instead, they were requesting human operators, or teams, trained by humans. And the economic impact was devastating to species that had built their entire cultures around warrior traditions. The mercenary rates had collapsed by 70%, and major companies were declaring bankruptcy, and skilled warriors who had fought for decades found themselves unemployed because no one wanted soldiers who fought with honor and tradition, when they could hire death worlders who fought to win. And General Patricia Brooks stood before the Coalition Military Command and listened to complaints from a dozen different species about how humans were destroying a vital part of galactic culture. General Brooks was a woman who had commanded operations on 15 different worlds, and she had lost soldiers under her command, and she had made decisions that kept her awake at night, and she listened to the complaints with patience until one ambassador suggested that humans should voluntarily limit their military operations to preserve the mercenary industry, and then her patience ended and she explained in very clear terms that Earth would not apologize for being good at keeping people alive. The mercenary leaders requested a formal meeting, and Zekathar was chosen to represent them because he had more experience with humans than anyone else, and he arrived on Earth with a delegation of 20 warriors from different species, and they expected to negotiate some kind of treaty that would divide the galaxy into spheres of influence. But what they got instead was an offer they had never considered. General Brooks proposed that instead of competing with human forces, the mercenary companies should learn from them, and she offered to open Earth's Special Forces training facilities to alien soldiers who wanted to understand how Deathworlders approached warfare, and the mercenary leaders looked at each other in confusion because they had expected threats or demands. But instead, they were being offered education. Zekthar asked what the cost would be, and General Brooks smiled and said that the cost was the same thing Earth demanded from its own soldiers, which was a commitment to excellence and a willingness to endure training that would break most people, and an acceptance that many who started the program would not finish it. And the Krillian commander realized that humans were offering respect through challenge rather than through negotiation. The first class of alien candidates arrived at Fort Jackson in North America 3 months later, and there were 200 soldiers from 30 different species, and they came expecting tough training, but they were not prepared for what humans considered basic qualification standards, and Lieutenant Commander Alex Rivera was responsible for the selection course, and he had been instructed to treat the alien candidates exactly the same as human candidates, which meant that 90% of them would fail. The selection course began at dawn on a Monday, and by Wednesday evening 140 candidates had voluntarily withdrawn because the physical demands exceeded anything they had experienced in their previous military service, and the remaining 60 pressed on because they were determined to prove that non-humans could meet Earth standards, and Alex watched them with a mixture of respect and concern because he knew that the real challenges had not even started yet. Sergeant Chris Bailey was the hand-to-hand combat instructor, and he was a man who had studied martial arts from 6 different Earth cultures, and he understood that fighting was not about strength or speed, but about leverage and timing and understanding how bodies moved, and he taught the alien candidates techniques that had been refined through thousands of years of humans fighting other humans, and the aliens learned that size and natural weapons meant nothing if you did not know how to use them properly. One of the candidates was named Kelran, and he was a young Krillian who had grown up hearing stories about his uncle Zekthar, and he had volunteered for the program because he wanted to understand why humans had become the galaxy's most feared warriors, and he struggled with the physical training because Krillians were built for short bursts of power, not for the extended endurance that humans demanded, but he refused to quit. The survival training took place in Alaska, where the temperature dropped below freezing at night, and candidates had to navigate 50 kilometers through wilderness with minimal equipment and no support, and they had to find food and water and shelter using only what they could scavenge, and for species that came from climate-controlled environments it was torture. But Alex explained that Earth's environments had taught humans to adapt or die, and that lesson was non-negotiable. Kelran nearly died on the 3rd night of survival training, when his body temperature dropped to dangerous levels, and he was found by Nicole Grant, who was monitoring the candidates from a distance, and she built a fire and wrapped him in an emergency blanket and explained that knowing your limits was not weakness but wisdom, and that humans had learned to survive by understanding when to push forward and when to conserve strength. By the end of the first phase, only 19 candidates remained, and they were exhausted and battered and questioning every decision that had brought them to Earth. But they had also learned something important, which was that human training was not designed to break people for the sake of breaking them, but to prepare them for situations where failure meant death, and there were no second chances. Lieutenant Sophie Blake taught the psychological operations course, and she explained that warfare was not just about physical capability, but about understanding how minds worked, and how fear could be weaponized, and how information could be as deadly as bullets, and the alien candidates struggled with concepts that seemed dishonest or dishonorable. But Sophie made them understand that Earth had never cared about honor, and that humans had learned to win by any means necessary. The close-quarters combat training took place in a facility that simulated urban environments, and candidates had to clear buildings room by room, while instructors played the role of enemies who used unpredictable tactics, and the aliens learned that human combat doctrine emphasized speed and violence of action, because hesitation got people killed, and there was no time for traditional challenges or formal combat protocols. Kelran asked Jake Morrison why humans fought with such intensity, and Jake took him to a museum that displayed artifacts from Earth's history. And he showed the Krillian warrior weapons that ranged from stone axes to nuclear missiles. And he explained that humans had spent their entire existence fighting for survival, first against nature and then against each other. And that had created a species that understood violence at a level no one else could match. The final exercise was a simulated hostage rescue that required the candidates to infiltrate a defended position and extract civilians without casualties. And it combined everything they had learned about stealth and tactics and teamwork, and of the 19 candidates who attempted it, only 5 succeeded, and Kelrun was one of them. And when Alex Rivera told him he had passed the selection course, the young Krillian warrior felt pride and exhaustion in equal measure. The graduation ceremony was simple, because humans did not believe in elaborate celebrations for doing what was expected, and the 5 alien candidates who completed the program stood alongside 20 human operators who had finished the same course, and they all received the same patch which showed a human handprint overlaid with text in multiple languages that said "Forged in Fire." Zekthar attended the graduation, and he watched his nephew receive his certification. And he felt something that Krillians did not often experience, which was humility, because he had spent decades believing that he understood warfare. But these humans had shown him that true understanding came from being tested by a world that offered no mercy, and surviving anyway. General Brooks spoke to the graduating class, and she explained that they were now part of something larger than themselves, and that they carried a responsibility to use their training wisely, and to remember that the purpose of warriors was to protect those who could not protect themselves. And that power without purpose was just violence, and violence without meaning was just destruction. The mercenary industry began to transform as more aliens completed the human training program, and they brought back techniques and doctrines that revolutionized how their species approached combat, and companies that adapted to the new methods survived while those that clung to tradition faded away, and Zekthar retired from active mercenary work to become an instructor at Fort Jackson, because he believed that teaching the next generation was more important than adding to his personal legend. Jake Morrison was promoted to major and given command of all special operations training programs, and he worked with alien instructors to develop courses that respected different physiologies while maintaining the core principles that made human tactics so effective. And the result was a new generation of warriors who understood that strength came from adaptability, not from tradition. Lieutenant Commander Alex Rivera told a reporter who was doing a story on the program that humans had never wanted to dominate galactic military. Why Alien Mercenaries Fear Death Worlder Special Forces. Part 518. Months after the first alien soldiers graduated from human training programs, the galaxy faced a threat that made every previous crisis seem insignificant. And the threat came from within the coalition itself, from a faction called the Ascendancy, that believed only the strongest species deserved to survive, and they had been secretly developing weapons and soldiers in hidden facilities beyond the edge of mapped space. The Ascendancy revealed themselves by conquering 4 star systems in 3 weeks, using warriors that seemed almost unstoppable, and these warriors were called the Vanguard, and they had been genetically engineered to combine the best physical traits of multiple species with technological enhancements that pushed them beyond natural limits. And intelligence analysts who studied combat footage realized with growing horror that the Vanguard had been designed specifically to fight humans. The Vanguard soldiers stood 7 feet tall with dense muscle tissue that could absorb impacts that would kill normal beings, and their reflexes were enhanced to match human speed, and their pain receptors had been reduced so they could fight through injuries that would incapacitate anyone else. And worst of all, they had been programmed with tactical databases that included every known human combat technique and doctrine. Admiral John Wright commanded the Coalition Defense Fleet, and he watched the Vanguard sweep through system after system, and he understood that conventional military forces could not stop them, because the Vanguard fought with the efficiency of machines and the adaptability of living beings, and they learned from each engagement and adjusted their tactics. And for the first time in recorded history, human special forces teams were taking casualties in operations that should have been routine. Lieutenant Colonel Jake Morrison sat in a briefing room surrounded by holographic displays, showing the Vanguard's advance, and he had been promoted twice in the past year, and now he commanded all Coalition special operations. But the promotion felt hollow because he was watching the tactical doctrine he had helped develop being used against him, and the Vanguard anticipated every move his teams made, because they had been designed to counter human methods. Dr. Rachel Kim was a xenobiologist who specialized in combat evolution, and she studied the Vanguard genetic profiles and explained to Jake that these engineered soldiers had been given human endurance and adaptability without the emotional limitations that sometimes made humans hesitate, and they felt no fear or doubt or compassion, and that made them perfect killers, but it also made them predictable in ways their creators had not anticipated. The Coalition Council met in emergency session and debated evacuation plans and defensive strategies and acceptable losses, and Ambassador Trelvik, who had seen humans save his world, stood before the council and said that if there was any species that could find a way to defeat the Vanguard, it was the Deathworlders, because humans had spent their entire existence overcoming enemies that should have been impossible to beat. Jake assembled his command staff and laid out a plan that made everyone in the room uncomfortable, because it required combining human operators with alien specialists in ways that had never been attempted, and it meant deploying 100 soldiers on a mission deep into Ascendancy territory to destroy the facilities where the Vanguard were being created, and everyone knew it was a one-way trip, but no one suggested an alternative. Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez volunteered to lead one of the mixed-species assault teams, and he had trained with alien soldiers for 6 months and learned to trust their capabilities, and he believed that combining human tactical thinking with alien specialized skills could create something more effective than either group alone, and his team included 2 Krillians, 1 Heliosan, and 3 humans. The mission launched from a stealth carrier that brought them within striking distance of the Ascendancy's core world, and the insertion went wrong immediately, because the Vanguard had sensors that detected the approach and the fleet of insertion. Craft came under fire before they reached the drop zone, and 30% of the force was killed before they even reached the ground. Jake led his team through the chaos of the landing zone, and they took cover behind debris from destroyed landing craft, and the Vanguard soldiers attacked with coordinated precision that matched anything human forces had ever demonstrated, and, for the first time, Jake understood what it felt like to fight an enemy that had no weaknesses and made no mistakes. Lieutenant Maya Johnson had taken command of Razor 7 when Jake was promoted, and she fought alongside her team with the calm efficiency that came from years of training, and when her point man was hit by Vanguard fire, she pulled him to safety while returning fire with her sidearm, and she called for a medic and kept fighting, because that was what human soldiers did. The operation plan fell apart within the first hour, because the Vanguard response was faster and more organized than any projection had predicted, and Jake made the decision that every Special Forces commander dreaded, which was to split his force into small hunter-killer teams and attack the production facilities from multiple directions simultaneously, and hope that speed and aggression could overcome the enemy's tactical advantage. Kelran fought beside Tony Martinez, and he used the techniques he had learned at Fort Jackson combined with his natural Krillian strength, and he understood now why humans emphasized adaptability over doctrine, because no plan survived contact. With an enemy like the Vanguard, and survival meant making instant decisions and living with the consequences. Linda Hayes reached one of the production facilities, and she placed demolition charges with hands that had done this 1,000 times before, and when a Vanguard soldier came through the door, she engaged him in close combat and discovered that these engineered warriors were stronger and faster, but they fought with programmed responses, and she used techniques that were not in any database because she had learned them from her father in a garage in Nebraska, and the Vanguard soldier fell. Danny Price provided overwatch from a damaged building, and he made shots that should have been impossible because his targets were moving with superhuman speed, but he had learned to shoot on a death world where prey did not wait to be hit, and he led his targets and adjusted for wind and gravity, and his bullets found their marks because precision was something humans had perfected long before they reached the stars. Nicole Grant worked in a field hospital that had been set up in a crater, and she treated humans and aliens with equal care, and when supplies ran low, she improvised with materials scavenged from the battlefield, and she kept soldiers alive through determination and skill and the refusal to accept that wounds were fatal, just because they looked impossible to treat. Jake fought his way toward the Central Command facility where the Overseer controlled all Vanguard operations, and he lost soldiers with every corridor they cleared, and each loss weighed on him. But he kept moving forward because stopping meant everyone had died for nothing. and he had learned long ago that commanders did not have the luxury of grief until the mission was complete. The Overseer was a being that had been engineered for tactical genius, and it stood in the command center surrounded by holographic displays showing the battle. And when Jake entered the room, it turned to face him with eyes that held no emotion, and it said that human defeat was inevitable because the Vanguard were superior in every measurable way. Jake responded that measurement was not the same as understanding, and that the Overseer had made the same mistake every enemy made, which was assuming that humans fought because they thought they could win, but humans fought because they refused to lose, and there was a difference, and that difference had kept humanity alive on a world that tried to kill them. Every single day. The battle in the command center was brutal and close, and Jake used every trick he had learned in 30 years of combat. And he took hits that would have killed most beings, but he kept fighting, because that was what Deathworlders did. And when he finally brought the Overseer down, it was not through superior strength or speed, but through the willingness to take damage that no rational being would accept. The production facilities exploded in a series of carefully timed detonations that Linda had orchestrated, and the Vanguard forces across the planet suddenly found themselves without coordination or reinforcements, and the human-alien teams pressed their advantage, and within 6 hours the Ascendancy's military capability had collapsed. 43 operators survived out of the 100 who had deployed, and they gathered at the extraction point and waited for pickup, and no one spoke because there were no words that could capture what they had endured and what they had lost. And Tony Martinez looked at his mixed species team and realized that they had proven something important, which was that the galaxy was stronger together than any one species could be alone. The war ended within weeks as the Ascendancy surrendered without their Vanguard soldiers, and the galaxy mourned the operators who had died and celebrated those who survived, and the Coalition erected a memorial on Earth that listed every name, human and alien, together because they had fought as one and died as one. Maya Johnson stood before her new team, and she looked at the faces of 3 humans and 2 aliens who had been trained in human methods, and she told them that they were part of a tradition that stalked her.